Good morning. It's Monday, September 23rd. The multi-front war in the Middle East is now 353 days old. I'm Jonathan Schanzer, Senior Vice President for Research at Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Welcome back to the FDD Morning Brief. Well, there were some wild rumors flying around yesterday afternoon. Some in Israel say that the IDF might, and I repeat, might, have finally taken out Hamas chief Yahya Sinwar. The mastermind of the October 7th attack was the intended target in one particular airstrike, and there are reports, not confirmed, that the terror chief has been incommunicado since then. My best sources in Israel are saying, don't hold your breath. I'll just leave it here and say, inshallah. We'll keep an eye on that story here at the FDD Morning Brief. Today's guest is Kasim Hafeez. He's a British citizen of Pakistani origin. He lived in Canada for a time and apparently became a huge hockey fan. Can't blame him. But he's an even bigger fan of Israel. Today, he works for Christians United for Israel, or CUFI, which is one of the largest Christian Zionist organizations in America, headed up by Pastor John Hagee, his wife Diana, and my good friend Shari Dollinger. We'll talk to Kasim momentarily about his journey and the terrific organization he works for today. Hezbollah, the Iran-backed terror group in Lebanon, is getting shellacked by Israel. In late July, Israel took out Fuad Shukr, a senior Hezbollah commander in the heart of Beirut. A few weeks later, when Hezbollah was minutes from firing hundreds of rockets, Israel destroyed them all before they launched. Last week, Hezbollah fighters suffered mass injuries and deaths when the Mossad detonated their beepers in a legendary spy operation. The following day, Hezbollah's walkie-talkies exploded too, taking out another wave of fighters. The remaining fighters are now afraid to answer their phones. This weekend, Israel killed top Hezbollah commander Ibrahim Akil and more than a dozen others, including from the Radwan forces, the fighters trained to invade northern Israel. Hezbollah is reeling, but it's not over. Hezbollah's arsenal includes 200,000 plus missiles that could overwhelm Israel's defenses. They have precision-guided munitions that can accurately hit Israeli bases, infrastructure, and other key sites across Israel. Yes, Hezbollah has fired thousands of rockets at Israel since October 8th and driven thousands more from their home. This war is fraught with danger. Israelis are tired. The population can't agree on the color of hummus right now, and the Biden administration is holding up weapons that Israel needs in order to win. Also, don't forget, the Iranians can still join the fight. The Houthis could too, and don't forget the Shiite militias in Iraq and Syria. So yes, Israel may be winning, and it could keep winning. But remember, winning a battle is not the same as winning a war. Unless you think that Israel is the only one in serious danger. Let's take a look at Hezbollah's war calculus. The terror group has been flirting with disaster since October 8th, when it began firing rockets and drones unprovoked at Israel. The group says it's fighting for the people of Gaza, but we know who they're really fighting for: the Islamic Republic of Iran. Since the early 1980s, Hezbollah has been a wholly owned subsidiary of the regime in Tehran. Today, the group is putting all of Lebanon at risk with this reckless war they've launched. An estimated 100,000 Lebanese have already fled their homes in southern Lebanon over the last few weeks amidst an uptake in Israeli airstrikes and ingenious technological operations. Alarm has spread across the country that they're headed back to the future. What does that mean? Hezbollah has dragged Lebanon to war multiple times. Each time it has brought nothing but misery, widespread destruction, mass casualties from Hezbollah's cynical use of human shields as a war strategy, and don't forget bankruptcy. The country's economy is already in a tailspin. Right now, Hezbollah is deciding if it should press its luck with the most advanced military in the Middle East. Sure, the group will land some blows with precision-guided munitions. And yes, there's a chance the White House will try to restrain Israel, but that's a big risk for Hezbollah to take. The group now stands at a crucial crossroads. Where do things go from here? I don't know. What I do know, Lebanon can ill afford what may be in store. Now for your headlines. Headline 1. Those Iran-backed militias in Iraq were back in action yesterday. Before dawn, the IDF intercepted 2 cruise missiles fired from Iraq toward the Golan Heights. 2 hours later, the IDF intercepted a drone approaching Israel from the same direction. Meanwhile, Israel also reportedly downed a projectile fired from Iraq towards Eilat. Thankfully, nothing penetrated Israeli airspace. The Islamic Resistance of Iraq, a loose coalition of Iran-backed militias, claimed responsibility for the attacks. The group said on its Telegram channel that they targeted an unspecified strategic location and launched their attacks, quote, in support of our people in Gaza, end quote. Headline 2, Israel cracked down on the operations of the Qatar-owned Al Jazeera network in the West Bank. Yesterday, IDF troops raided Al Jazeera's office in Ramallah and informed the local bureau chief of a military order to shutter the office for 45 days. Everyone had to be out within 10 minutes. Al Jazeera broadcast this exchange live. After the staff gathered their personal belongings and exited the building, the IDF proceeded to seize equipment, including cameras and computers. This didn't come out of the blue here. Israel passed a law in the spring authorized the temporary closure of Al Jazeera due to national security concerns. And no, I don't believe this was a blatant assault on the freedom of the press. The IDF apparently had fresh intel indicating that Al Jazeera's offices were being used to support terror. This is my shocked face. Al Jazeera is owned by the state of Qatar, a mega-rich petro-state that funds Hamas and shelters senior Hamas leaders. And don't forget all the other groups they have supported over the years, like Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and more. Apparently, former and aspiring President Donald Trump lost sight of that when he met with Qatar's leadership over the weekend and declared they were dedicated to Middle East peace. And headline 3, Hamas flatly rejected yet another U.S.-sponsored ceasefire deal. This comes amidst some terrible news. In a closed meeting with Knesset members, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said yesterday that he believes that roughly half of the remaining hostages in Gaza are still alive. I had a tough conversation with a close friend from Israel about this the other night. You have to wonder whether Hamas is ever going to make a deal. Diplomacy doesn't seem to work with them. Neither does military pressure, for that matter. I'm heartbroken for the hostage families, but also worried about the growing tension between the Israelis who want to win the war and those who still believe that a deal can be struck. My view, a deal would be amazing. I'm all for it, but it all depends on the cost. Protecting 10 million Israelis must be the top priority for the Israeli government. Okay, I'm now pleased to introduce Kasim Hafeez. Kasim has had quite a journey from a proponent of radical Islam to a staunch Zionist. We'll talk to him about that, as well as the group he represents, Christians United for Israel. I've been a speaker at CUFI events for years now. I've never met a warmer crowd, and I'm pleased to welcome Kasim to speak with us live right now on the FDD Morning Brief. Welcome to the FDD Morning Brief, Kasim Hafeez.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's an honor.
It's an honor to have you. I want to start with a burning question that I've never actually asked you in person. How did you get here? I mean, how does a Muslim of Pakistani origin end up working for a Christian Zionist group deep in the heart of Texas?
You know, I ask myself the same thing many, many days. So I grew up in England, British Pakistani Muslim family. They came to the UK. My grandparents did as immigrants. And I think there's an important point I want to emphasize, that my grandparents came to the UK as very conventional economic migrants. They came for a better life. They came for everything that British society had to offer. You know, we've had instances even just before I left the UK where you had people coming to the UK from Muslim countries, and this isn't everybody. And there was almost this ideological drive to change British society. My grandparents' generation were not like that. I grew up in a predominantly Muslim immigrant community, and I was growing up at a time where you had the Soviet-Afghan War, you had the situation, you know, in the former Yugoslavia, you had the situation with satanic verses. So Muslims and Islam was becoming very, very much the topic of discussion for many Brits. And with that came this crisis of identity for many British-born Pakistani Muslims, predominantly. And into that void stepped extremist groups like Hizb ut-Tahrir and Al-Muhajirun, and gave us almost a point of rallying, somewhere to belong. I went down that path. I became very radicalized because that's essentially what their whole agenda is. And I was well on the way to becoming a terrorist. I was, you know, connecting with Lashkar-e-Taiba in Pakistan, feeling very isolated from British society. That took a very dramatic turn when I ended up in Israel in 2007. after having some doubts. And I didn't go to Israel with this open heart of wanting to see the truth. I went with this idea of I'm so conflicted at the moment with all the mixed messaging I'm getting. If I go to Israel, I'll see how evil it is. And honestly, and this surprises a lot of people, it was the normality of it, as normal as the Middle East can be, about Israel, which really resonated.
Amazing. Well, so we know where you've ended up, which is
Yeah.
at CUFI. So tell us a little bit about Christian Zionists. How many of them are there in America? How many of them are there around the world? What do they believe?
So Christian Zionism, CUFI alone has over 10 million members. And so there are many millions more in the United States. And unlike any group, Christian Zionists are not monolithic. But the predominant belief among Christian Zionism is that God has made a covenant with Israel, which still stands, which flies in the face of replacement theology and many other things which fed anti Semitism within the church, and that the rebirth of Israel, the modern state of Israel, is a continuation of that for a biblical promise. And so it is incumbent on Christians, based on what the Bible says, what Genesis says about blessing Abraham, that we must stand with Israel, the reborn state of Israel, and the Jewish people.
So you mentioned replacement theology. I sort of feel like this is the elephant in the room. So
Right.
let's talk about this right now. This is the thing I hear from anyone who's skeptical about Christian Zionists. They say that all the Christians want is to have all the Jews in the world gather in Israel for when the end times come so that the Messiah returns. I know that's not what CUFI wants, but perhaps you can just explain for a bit what this theology means and what are the alternatives.
No, for sure. Firstly, let me just state this, that I am currently in biblical theology school. So it's been really interesting looking at replacement theology. So it's twofold. One, it's the idea that God has rejected the Jewish people, hence, his covenants no longer stand. And this is also interwoven into some of the things you're hearing from some commentators now, the idea that the Jews killed Jesus and have been rejected. And with that comes, one, this manifestation of Christian anti Semitism, which we've seen throughout history, and two, becomes a complete rejection of the land of Israel, the state of Israel, the Jewish people in Israel, and almost a complete negation of Jewish history. And the final component to that is that this idea that if we are going to support Israel and the Jewish people, it has to be from this apocalyptic vision of, as you said, gathering them in Israel, and that will hasten the coming of Jesus and these cataclysmic events. Now, replacement theology is simply not biblical. It isn't. It's not a biblical theology. It doesn't have any biblical basis. It originates in the second and third century, where there was an attempt by Christian theologians and early church fathers to separate Christianity from Judaism, because Jesus was Jewish. So you have this theology that emerges, which essentially blames the Jews for the Jesus being crucified. And now, from a biblical perspective, that makes no sense, because the Bible teaches that Jesus died for all of our sins. We are all culpable in Jesus's crucifixion, because if you take things that, say, like Candace Owens has said of the Jews killing Jesus, so if Jesus isn't crucified, so then what does that mean for the Christian faith? That's the single most important part of the Christian faith, the death and the resurrection. So if he's not crucified, so then where does that leave us?
Interesting. Well, I want to check back with you as you continue to study this. It sounds like quite a journey you're on. But in the meantime, I want to ask you just a little bit about what Christians United for Israel is doing, what they have been doing since October 7th. How has the Christian Zionist community responded to this war that is now about to hit the 1 year mark?
For sure. So since October 7th, we have donated over $11 million to causes in Israel, primarily first responders and organizations who've been working on the ground after that awful attack. We've mobilized hundreds of churches. We've done hundreds of events all over the US, from Israel You Are Not Alone events, solidarity events, educational events, because it's sort of really mixed into one. And we've seen that the response has been incredible from our membership. It really has been a moment where people realized that they had to act and they had to speak up and have really mobilized. And from a legislative perspective, when we had the holdup with the Israel aid bill, CUFI, in 3 or 4 days, we put together a fly into Washington, D.C. 50 Christian leaders from all over the United States came. We lobbied. A few days later, the bill was passed. I'm not saying it was because of us, but I'm not saying it wasn't because of us. And essentially, we continue to see where the need is, what needs to be done, and fulfilling that need. At CUFI, we never want to mistake motion for movement. So when we act, we want to be moving the needle forward, not just making noise.
I like that mentality. I know you've spent a lot of time in both the UK and Canada. Both countries have been disappointing. I think we can say that quite clearly.
Yeah.
Disappointing since the war began, right? From some equivocating as it relates to moral clarity, the withholding of weapons, really, I think, hamstringing Israel as it faces Iran on 7 fronts. So what's happening in both of these Five Eyes countries right now that are supposed to be staunch allies of Western values?
I think we're seeing, one, a lack of courage. We're seeing a lack of, as you said, moral clarity and courage and standing up for what's right. And I think what is particularly disturbing is we're seeing at the political level, policy being shaped by what is happening on the street. We're seeing a priority going to, and I want to say this, but I want to clarify it. The immigrant populations coming from the Muslim world do have an impact. People are trying to get votes. But I'm not. I don't want to say that is the sole reason. I don't want to be this alarmist of, oh my God, they're changing everything. There's just within Canadian and British society, and especially within the elites, we're seeing this approach to the Middle East, which is very much rooted in looking at the Middle East the way we want to, rather than what the ground realities are. We're not seeing what Israel is facing. We're almost treating Israel like it is the United States or it's Canada, and it's not facing these threats directly on its borders. And we're just showing a complete lack of moral clarity, moral will, and of being shaped by essentially what we're seeing in the media rather than what is the actual ground reality and why is this happening? Like what is, and as you've referenced many, many times, because of the Islamic Republic and because of its proxies.
Last question for you here. I bumped into you on Friday at the IAC, the Conference of the Israeli American Council. That was really quite an event. Tell us a little bit about your experience there. What went down?
Yeah, no, it was a great event. It was really special to see so many people together. And I think, full disclosure, I'm not a huge fan of conferences because there are so many, but I think at a time right now where we're seeing so much anti-Semitism in America, all over the world, so much anti-Israel rhetoric, these moments of unity and togetherness are really meaningful. And while it was the Israeli American Council, you see so many people from different backgrounds who just want to be there to show solidarity and also want to learn, want to understand the issues more, want to know how they can make a difference at an individual level and in their communities. And I think that's a beautiful thing.
It's nice to see. All right, we're going to leave it there. Kasim Hafeez, thank you so much for joining us today live on the FDD Morning Brief.
Thank you.
All right, here's what FDD has on tap for you today. My colleague Tony Bowman has published a piece in Real Clear Education highlighting one of Beijing's most insidious efforts to infiltrate American minds, the Confucius Classrooms Initiative in K through 12 schools. These so-called cultural exchange outposts are a troubling extension of the CCP's propaganda apparatus. U.S. officials must recognize the national security threats posed by this program and shut it down. My colleague Craig Singleton spurred legislators in Washington to shut it down in higher education. Here's my question to Congress. Are younger Americans not worth the same effort? FDD research analyst Mariam Wahba has penned a piece in the National Review on Egypt's self-made crisis along the Philadelphia corridor. Cairo is asserting that Israel's presence in the corridor poses intolerable challenges to its security and its other interests in the region. Mariam underscores, however, that Cairo played a role in precipitating the 10-7 wars in the first place by permitting Hamas to smuggle weapons and more into Gaza by way of tunnels and overland smuggling. It's long past time for Washington to put some pressure on Cairo to explain what happened and to begin to take steps to ensure that it doesn't happen again. Finally, check out my colleague Behnam Bentalablou's latest piece in The Hill, where he highlights a significant discrepancy in the Biden administration's rhetoric since 10-7. While officials stress a desire for both de-escalation and deterrence, Behnam points out that true deterrence requires adversaries to perceive a willingness to escalate. He argues that Tehran may be banking on the U.S. prioritizing de-escalation over deterrence, an important distinction here. This could undermine Israel's war aims and represent a win for the regime in Tehran. Smart guy, that Behnam. All right, that's a wrap for today. Read our expert analysis on our website, fdd.org. Read our quick takes on X at FDD and support our work with a tax-deductible donation at fdd.org/invest. Tune in Wednesday for another episode of the FDD Morning Brief. We are right now lining up some great guests as we steer into the one-year mark of this war. Hard to believe that October 7th is rapidly approaching. See you Wednesday. I'm Jonathan Schanzer, signing off for FDD.